I ultimately got my nightmare professor fired one semester before he would have qualified for tenure. And my partner in crime might have indirectly gotten him deported too. It all started with an introductory French class I took simply because I needed the credits. Last semester, I enrolled in an intro French course at my university. As a hardcore film student, my main goal was to learn just enough French to read academic papers on French filmmaking techniques. Plus, it fulfilled a general education credit I needed for my degree. So it seemed like a logical choice. I walked into the first lecture with a sense of dread already settling in. I was taking on a massive 19 credit hours, that's 6 different classes in one semester, and this French class was a 4 credit hour beast. Meaning we met 4 days a week. Every single week. My schedule was overwhelming, to say the least. And working a job was completely out of the question. The professor, who I'll call Professor Dubois, started going through the syllabus. As he spoke, I watched the usual first-day excitement drain from the faces of my classmates. Before I get into why, I need to emphasize that this was the most basic, entry-level French class the university offered. It was designed for people like me, who had never taken a single lesson of French in their lives. Professor Dubois announced that he would be teaching the entire class in fluent French, with no English translations whatsoever. He wouldn't answer questions in English at all. And if you tried to ask a question in French but made a single mistake in wording or conjugation, he would simply ignore you. Attendance was mandatory, and you were only allowed to miss 4 classes before he started docking letter grades from your final score. This policy was patently unfair. We met just under 60 times that semester. Meaning if you missed 8 classes, only about 7% of the total course, you would automatically fail. I glanced around the room, and people looked like they were already planning their escape to the registrar's office to drop the class. Then, he announced we wouldn't be using a physical textbook. Instead, we'd use a free online site called Francais Interactif. This brought a brief flicker of excitement back into the room. Textbooks are ridiculously expensive, and anything that lowers the cost of education is a win for students. However, the website wasn't a true substitute for a proper textbook. While it had a free workbook and helpful audio files for comprehension, which did help some of us scrape by on exams, the actual teaching component was severely lacking. Critical language concepts were sometimes explained in just a couple of short paragraphs. In essence, the site gave you a ton of ways to practice French, but almost no way to actually learn the concepts in the first place. This would have been fine if Professor Dubois had been a competent lecturer. But as I mentioned, he taught entirely in rapid, fluent French. So, picture this: you have to sit through 4 one-hour classes every week, understanding literally nothing. The professor is rambling on in a language you're desperately trying to learn, but it's all just a blur of sound. You can't ask for clarification in English because he won't answer. And you can't ask in French because you don't know how. The unit on forming questions was bizarrely scheduled for weeks after the midterms. On top of it all, you can't effectively study or do your homework because you have no foundational knowledge of what any of this nasally language even means. One user who read my story later commented, "I'm amazed at how many teachers and managers have no idea how to do their jobs at all." And that perfectly captured the sentiment in the room. Professor Dubois announced his draconian rules with an air of academic superiority, completely unaware that this very refusal to actually teach would be the thing that ultimately ended his career at the university. Naturally, as the weeks dragged on, the entire class grew more and more frustrated. A few of us banded together, forming a small group of study partners to try and weather the storm. The two most important to this story were Sophia and Kyle. Sophia was an exchange student from Spain. She spoke perfect Spanish and was taking the class to add French to her linguistic arsenal for when she returned to Europe. We did some digging and discovered that Professor Du Bois also taught Spanish. This gave us an idea, a loophole. We could ask Sophia a question in English. She could then translate it and ask the professor in Spanish. Since it wasn't English, he was bound by his own stupid rules to answer. He could reply in Spanish, and Sophia would translate it back to us. It was a ridiculously convoluted way to learn. And no self-respecting educator should have forced students into such a scheme. You're right to think it's completely absurd. Our little system worked for a short while. But Du Bois caught on. He started responding to Sophia's Spanish questions in French, deliberately shutting down our only line of communication. We were defeated and back at square one, with most of us failing and stress levels at an all-time high. This is where Kyle comes in. Kyle was a frat guy, and I was decidedly not. But we became unlikely friends in our shared struggle. He was a bit naive and a heavy drinker, which visibly took a toll on him. At 22, he already had a beer gut, and his issues with addiction seemed to have hollowed him out, leaving him emotionally volatile and quick to anger. I felt for him and tried to be a supportive friend, even outside of our class-related misery. One day, we decided to meet at the library to brainstorm a way to just crack the class and secure a passing grade of 60. At the library, Kyle was messing around on the Francais Interactive website, trying to find the audio clips the professor used for the listening portions of our exams. These were notoriously difficult and a major reason for the class's low grades. Frustrated after failing to find them, he started typing random words into the homework answer boxes. That's when we discovered it. The website, no matter how wrong your answer was, would immediately provide the correct one. We had just stumbled upon the answer key for the entire course's homework. Since our assignments just required us to copy and paste our answers into a Word document, we could now complete all the homework with zero knowledge of the material. We sat there for about 45 minutes and finished the homework for the rest of the semester. We agreed to submit the assignments gradually to avoid suspicion and to only share this exploit with a few trusted people, including Sophia. I'll never forget the final exam for that first French class. During the test, a student near me started to cry, quietly at first. Then the weeping grew louder, more desperate. He was clutching his head, and you could feel the raw, impotent frustration radiating from him. After I finished, I found him in the hallway, staring out a window. I asked if he was okay. He told me he couldn't even answer the most basic questions, words for left and right, up and down. That was what finally broke him. That really got to me. Even with the homework exploit, most of the class failed. Sophia and Kyle passed with a D. I, surprisingly, managed a C. For some reason, Professor Du Bois seemed to like me and graded my exams a little more leniently. Still, as an AB student in the university's honors program, a C was a painful blow to my GPA. But seeing as over half the class had failed, I counted myself lucky. When I went to enroll for the next semester, I had a horrifying realization: I still needed to take another French class. I checked the course catalog, and beginning French 2 was only taught by one person, Professor Du Bois. I scrolled through the rest of the French courses. All 6 of them, from beginner to advanced, were taught by him. He was the entire French department. My stomach dropped. I had locked myself into another semester with the worst professor I had ever had. This is where the revenge begins. I had to provide that context to truly convey how uniquely horrible this man was as an educator. I had kept in touch with Kyle and Sophia over winter break. Sophia was returning to Spain. But I convinced Kyle to enroll in the same section of French 2 with me. The first day was déjà vu. Du Bois handed out a syllabus identical to the first semester's. Right down to using Francais Interactif. Just for the more advanced chapters. The fundamental problem with learning a language is that you have to build from the basics. No one in that class, not a single person, knew the material past maybe chapter 3 of the first course. Most of us still couldn't even ask a proper question. Since Sophia was gone, I became the designated question asker for the few who needed it. If we struggled with the basics, we absolutely floundered when we got to complex concepts with no direct English translation. Whenever Du Bois asked a student a question, they would just stare at him, dumbfounded, and shrug. He gave us a study guide for the first exam, and I was determined to do better than AC. I studied for 20 hours over the course of a week, pouring more effort into this class than my own major courses. I walked into the exam, opened the test booklet, and my heart sank. Nothing I had studied was on it. I bombed it spectacularly, scoring a 30%. At that point, I was done. I went to his office hours to ask how I could possibly study for his exams effectively. His response is what ignited my quest for revenge. He told me to watch YouTube videos. I don't know why, but that dismissive, unhelpful answer filled me with a white-hot rage. But that wasn't the only catalyst. The real motivation came when Kyle called me, sobbing, after getting his exam back. He had done even worse than me, scoring a 15%. Through his tears, he kept repeating that he just wanted to be a good student and that he couldn't bear to disappoint his mom again. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried with him. I thought about the student who broke down during the final. I thought about my other peers. And I thought about Kyle. Something inside me snapped. At that moment, a decision born from a mix of empathy and pure rage solidified in my mind, setting in motion a chain of events far exceeding a simple complaint to the dean. I was going to get this man fired. And Kyle was going to be my right-hand man. We met in his dorm room and started brainstorming. It was halfway through the semester, and time was a luxury neither of us had. We both had jobs, significant others, and extracurriculars. And I was once again taking 19 credit hours. We knew Du Bois would be gone for a week at a conference after spring break, giving us a 2-week window. It wasn't enough. I forged a doctor's note for a 2-week absence. And Kyle agreed to use all 4 of his allowed absences. We would meet during our scheduled French class time to plan our peaceful academic coup. I knew from the start I'd probably get caught for the fake note. But I was so confident I could get Du Bois fired before my disciplinary hearing that I took the gamble. Du Bois took the bait and excused me for 2 weeks. So, what did we do? We used that time to conduct interviews with our classmates and collect data. We managed to get statements about Professor Du Bois's performance from 13 of the 17 students in our class section. Every single one was negative. Next, we asked for their exam scores to get some hard data. All but 2 complied. We did the math and found that more than half the class was failing the exams, with most scores hovering between 30% and 50%. But it turned out we didn't even need them to volunteer their scores. We discovered that our university's online grade portal had a feature that displayed the class average for every assignment. Not a single assignment, besides the homework inflated by our exploit, had a class average above 50%. Sure enough, I eventually received a notice that I had violated the university's discipline code for the forged note. But it didn't matter. I had everything I needed. I scheduled a meeting with the chair of the foreign language department. I walked into his office and laid everything out, the damning grade data, the written statements, and even audio recordings of the student testimonies. The department chair was dumbfounded. He sat there, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine shock as he listened to the audio and reviewed the spreadsheets. He had no idea Du Bois was such a terrible teacher. Almost no one had ever filled out the course evaluations for French I. So from his perspective, everything was fine. He took all my evidence and promised to pass it up to the Dean of Arts and Sciences. A couple of weeks later, an email landed in my inbox. Professor Du Bois was gone. He had been fired. I, along with everyone else who would have likely failed, was to be withdrawn from the course. The few who might have passed were given a credit-received grade without having to take the final. He was fired one semester before he would have qualified for tenure. As one commenter later noted, "I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad you stepped in when you had. It felt like a massive victory." But that's not the end of the story. After my disciplinary hearing was thrown out because the complainant was no longer employed by the university, I learned something that took this tale to a whole new level. During his lectures, one of the few times Du Bois spoke English was on the first day when he introduced himself. I remembered him mentioning that he was an immigrant from Venezuela. Kyle, as I mentioned, is pretty conservative. After we got the news about Du Bois, we celebrated with some beers. We were just shooting the breeze, talking about the class, when the fact that he was an immigrant came up. Kyle, who apparently hadn't known, became visibly upset. This revealed Kyle's most dangerous trait, a reactionary nature that would push this story of academic revenge into something far more severe. I tried to calm him down, but he launched into a rant that I just tried to tune out. I didn't think anything of it until he called me a couple of days later. He told me that he had tipped off a certain immigration agency about Professor Du Bois, requesting a visa check, his words, not mine. I was shocked. I never intended for things to go this far. I feigned approval, but in reality, I felt a pit in my stomach. Since he was likely in the United States on an academic visa tied to his professorship, his firing meant he would probably be sent back home to Venezuela. A commenter on my story later summed it up perfectly: the course evaluation was definitely pro-revenge. But that deportation escalates it to /r/nuclear revenge. I am glad he won't be teaching, or rather, not teaching, any more students at my university. I wouldn't wish his classes on my worst enemy. But the final outcome left me with a complicated feeling, a mix of vindication and unease. This story is a powerful reminder that while collective action can right a terrible wrong, the path of revenge can lead to unforeseen and morally ambiguous places. So, I have to ask you, was my friend's final action a step too far? Or was it a fitting end for a professor who cared so little for his students' futures? Let me know what you think in the comments below.